Good evening, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre. My name's Sally Warhaft, and tonight we're talking about religion and politics, and particularly Christianity in politics and public life, and how it informs thinking and influences policy and impacts on public life and policy in Australia. Of course, two of the three most recent Prime Ministers in Australia have been quite overtly devout Christians, Kevin Rudd and, of course, Prime Minister Tony Abbott. And then Julia Gillard in the middle, who proclaimed her atheism. And I thought, this is a topic that always lingers in Australia, but it would be great to get some people who have thought about this a lot in their working lives and in their inner lives to come and talk to us about it tonight. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the two Tims. Tim Fischer, of course, was the leader of the National Party, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Trade in the Howard government. He later became the Australian Ambassador to the Holy See, and he's the author of several books, including his memoir of his time, their Holy See, Unholy Me, 1,000 Days in Rome. Tim Costello, of course, is the CEO of World Vision, and he also served as a Baptist minister and has been active in every level of public life, both here in Australia and abroad. Please give them a really warm Wheeler welcome. I was thinking this morning about, what to open this discussion with. I know the sort of themes of things I wanted to discuss, but I was thinking, what should I open it with? And then I was looking at the news and the Australian, actually, and they had a little article in there that had just... Have I nicked this off you, Tim? You thought you'd got the scoop.
Stolen his thunder.
Yeah, no, sorry. The Australian War Memorial has abandoned a proposal, this is just a few hours old, this story, to remove the words "known unto God" from the tomb of the Australian unknown soldier. And it was after the personal intervention of Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Now, this came about, the Memorial's Governing Council had decided to replace two inscriptions on the tomb, and to replace them with words from a speech of the unknown soldier, of course, given by Paul Keating 20 years ago. The Memorial's director is the former leader of the Liberal Party, Brendan Nelson, and it was his idea, but the decision has been overturned at the personal intervention of the Prime Minister. So I thought I would open by asking both of you what you think of this, just as a way into our conversation. And Tim, since I've trumped you on the scoop, I'll let you go first.
Good question, and thank you all for coming. And the Australian War Memorial is going to become increasingly important over the next 4 or 5 years as we go through the centenaries of not only Gallipoli, the Battle of the Somme, 20,000 dead one morning thanks to an idiotic British general, through to the Battle of Hamel, led by John Monash, and so forth. Brendan Nelson, when he was ambassador in Brussels, stepped up and went to something like 80 ode ceremonies at Menham Gate. His commitment probably was one of the instrumental factors in the Council of the War Memorial appointing him as director. The call that has now been made to retain those words is absolutely correct, in my view. Let's stand up for the fact we are essentially much of our nationhood since 1788 to a broad-based Christian ethic and ethos, and with regard to the unknown soldier, all of them, hundreds of them, we salute them, and they are known only to God.
But is it the job of the Prime Minister of the day to override the directive of a council set up to make those decisions?
Look, let me yield to Tim, but firstly just say, you elect governments to do things. You elect Prime Ministers to make a difference. Prime Minister Rudd, I thank him, let me put on the record, appointed me as the first Rome resident Australian ambassador to the Holy See, and that was a tremendous experience to represent Australia to the nation city-state of the Holy See, itself a member of the United Nations. Prime Minister Abbott has apparently, I'm not sure that that's the full story, but has reached a conclusion which I think ultimately, deservedly, will be backed by the vast majority of thinking Australians.
Tim Costello.
So I think this is a fault line that is exactly the reason we're having this discussion tonight, namely a very clear Judeo-Christian heritage, ethic, impact, and now increasingly a secular society, mind you. Still 61% of Australians say they're Christian. It's down from 63% in the last census, but it's actually more people because we've grown, 13 million. But that sort of fault line is exactly why we're having this debate. What I think is really interesting, and by the way, I actually support Tim on this. I think Paul Keating's words are magnificent, but the actual words that have been there, I think, should stay. But the really interesting thing for me is that arguably Anzac Day is now our holiest day. The shrine to the mighty dead, the Lawrence Binyon words, lest we forget, the liturgy and the Rudyard Kipling words, the music, the reveille, did I say that right, is profoundly religious. And I think once you try and tamper with anything, and having been a Baptist minister, even just changing the point in the service where the choir sings can get you sacked, you're tampering with something that is invested with deep feelings of the sacred, of transcendence, of sacrifice, certainly in the War Memorial. And I think this debate actually suggests that in trying to ask the question, what expresses it best, we're touching something that now, for Australians, is profoundly sacred and very, very deep.
People, there was a sense around the time of the election, I suppose, but in the lead-up when Tony Abbott took over as leader of the opposition and the polls were continually going his way, that somehow this is more of a concern around Tony Abbott. I've always found this curious because I think that Kevin Rudd is just as devout as Tony Abbott, and there have been others. I think Peter Garrett, and there are many Catholics on both sides of Parliament and Christians. But there's something around Tony Abbott that seems to attract more commentary, more fear, I think, in some people. There are, the mad monk and these kind of descriptions and so on. What do you think this is? I mean, is my perception, do you think that's true? And if so, what is it? Is it a left-right thing? Is it a personality thing? Tim Fischer.
Look, if you are the leader of one of the major parties federally, you're going to be scrutinised, and I think it's just become paralleling all that's happened here in Australia. We have a new pope. He happens to be a Jesuit, he happens to be Argentinian, happens to be the first Southern Hemisphere pope, and bit by bit he's cleaning out some very bad elements at the centrum of the Catholic Church, more work to be done. And he's just sacked a German bishop who's managed to spend several $1 million on his Presbyterian palace and 750,000 euros on his bathroom fittings. Good call, Pope Francis. But that's sort of stimulated another look at every Jesuit educated, Joe Hockey, Tony Abbott, Barnaby Joyce, and Bill Shorten, electricity Bill Shorten, is also from my old school, Xavier College, out here at Kew, where I was an hour ago. So I think it's a confluence. One's triggered the other and bounced around. But let me make a point that I don't think you are wise in federal or state parliament to wear your religion on your sleeve. You don't walk away from it. You acknowledge, in my case, my Christianity, my epiphany at Mount Nebo a couple of years ago, when suddenly everything fell into place. As you look out from this mountain on the western side of Jordan, and there's the Dead Sea, there's the hills around Bethlehem, Jerusalem shining in the distance, Jericho down the front, Galilee up to the right, and suddenly both the Old Testament, New Testament, everything gelled for me. But I haven't shared that very widely, and I'm happy to do it here in the Wheeler Centre in the circumstance of this gathering, because I would advise Tony Abbott, I would advise Joe Hockey, I would advise Barnaby Joyce, and I would advise Bill Shorten: do not wear your religion up front on your sleeve. Don't jam it down people's throats, but nevertheless don't walk away from it, and use it in your calculus as you deal with some very difficult and complex issues in the second decade of the 21st century.
Well, I'm glad Tim's still alive. Moses died on Mount Nebo. He didn't ever get into the promised land. Good to have you here, Tim. Look, I think with Tony there's a couple of things going on. In some ways, I think it's a bit like John Kennedy, who needed to explain that his religion wasn't going to intervene at all into his presidency, because this fear of a hierarchical church and a pope and someone above. And of course, Tony being a seminarian, there was a little bit more of that intensity, I guess people would think about that belief. I think it's fascinating, Tim knows more about this than me, that the sectarianism in Australia, though thankfully gone, is really still got some sense in people's minds of, does religion play a role? And that Catholic fear, I think, was always stronger. Now, you couldn't get into the Liberal Party once when you're a Catholic when it started. Now the whole front bench is Catholic. Not quite. Well, half of it, as is the Labor. But I think there's a whole lot of still vague feelings that somehow are unfair and attached there. And look, I think religion and politics' essential difficulty is this. Religion is what you believe is absolutely true, and it cannot be compromised. Politics, by definition, is about compromise. It's saying, yes, I have still guiding instincts, but polis, the Greek word for city-state, was a cosmopolitan state with different gods, different religions, different ethnicities. How do you live together if you believe your God's absolutely true and your belief system's absolutely true? So I think when religion and politics is brought together, it raises a whole lot of these feelings. How much of that absolutism that religion, claims in you is going to play out? Now, I think with Tony and I think with Australian politicians generally, we are ultimately utilitarian. I think we are children of Jeremy Bentham. I think Americans are much more children of Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan. And in the end, pragmatism here with our politicians, and I'm pleased about this given the ideological things that happen in America, is a completely different story. We don't see ourselves as Americans do, a light set on a hill, a light in a dark place, a city set on a hill. We don't have that religious story that is about a promised land and manifest destiny. I think it's much more pragmatic here. But I think the Catholic bit in Tony still raises, to answer your question, some of those old, out-of-date fears, and I'm hoping they're going to pass away altogether.
When I was first elected to the New South Wales State Parliament at age 24, 1971, some would say during the Boer War, it was that long ago, not quite. One New South Wales Deputy Commissioner of Police had to be, no ifs, no buts, a Mason, and the other Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Police Force had to be a Catholic. And that was a stipulation that no Premier could get around until about 10 years after that, when everyone said, enough, basta, absolutely enough. So much did that carry on. Today, we have Muslim and Buddhist and many others, other than just the Abrahamic religions in Parliament. And I welcome that rich diversity that they bring. And I might add, with that comes different concepts such as gross national happiness. Out of the Kingdom of Bhutan, I'm envoy to Bhutan. I've written a book about Bhutan, Bold Bhutan Beckons. And the reason I mention that is that you might say that's beyond the spectrum of religion. I would say it's a set of values that reflects the diversity that's now entering into parliamentary thinking, both federal and state, and well might that be so.
In a way, I mean, what doesn't reflect it is the real number of politicians who are practising some religion or another. It's actually much higher than the general public,
population.
Unless, of course, they start praying once they get elected.
I might say that one of the beefs that I constantly get from Christians, prayerful, well-meaning, devout, is, Tim, if just we could get more Christians elected to Parliament. I say, do you know how many we've got there? And they say, well, of course, party system and loyalty and a whole lot of other things, and the pragmatism I'm talking about is often much stronger than being able to wear your faith on your sleeve. But we, as you say, have far greater proportion than the general population, and I don't think a lot of Christians know that.
Tim Costello, did your own faith and beliefs in the decision you made to not, or times you've been asked, of course, we all know, to enter public life, and time and again you've said no, apart from the fact of your commitment to the work you have chosen, was your faith and the fact of the tension and the compromise that has to be there when you talk about faith as absolute and politics as constant compromise? Did that factor into your decision making? Yeah,
look, in the Costello family, the only things we were interested in was religion and politics. Most families say the only things to stay away from are religion and politics if you're going to ruin the whole family. So it was a little bit of a strange family there. My father was a politics teacher. We were devout. We were going to a Baptist church, and Sunday lunches would always start with a sermon, and 2-3 hours later you're still debating. I remember at about 12, one of my friends saying to me, "Your family is seriously weird." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We just eat our lunch and go and watch World of Sport. You just keep debating and talking." I thought all families did what we did. So look, for me, it's not the question that faith is incompatible with me choosing to go into politics. It was actually a sense of calling. And I don't mean this just in a religious sense, becoming a Baptist minister. In a vocational sense, that sense that politics is always and has always been my great temptation, but it's not my vocation. The sense that what I'm doing lives out my faith and my deepest values more truly than politics, which isn't to say politics couldn't be an option, shouldn't be an option.
It's sort of the flip side to Tony Abbott.
I think so.
That temptation he has had.
Yep. I've not talked to Tony about that, but I certainly have felt that politics allows you to pull some levers of power for a little while, but actually kicking open the cracks that allow politicians to do the right things in moments, because it's much less power than you think, is my job, to be out there, a voice, saying these are things we can organise around and give you courage to take a stand on. Actually, I think that's what I see my calling as.
Well, what about for you, Tim? Because you were brought up a Catholic, you are a practising church-going Catholic. You made that decision to go into politics. Tell us how you grappled with it, or times when you must have grappled with it, where debates are happening or decisions are being made.
I think the first year I arrived in federal parliament from New South Wales State Parliament, there was a conscience vote on an amendment in respect to the issue of abortion, and I thought this is going to ruin my career, because my first vote, I remember sitting directly opposite my then leader, the Right Honourable Ian Sinclair. But to be fair, Ian Sinclair said, "What's your view on this matter? I've got this other view." And 12 months later, he promoted me to the front bench. So I respect that you should separate out these things. So what drove me was an imperfect work in progress commitment to my faith. I've always said I'm a less than perfect practitioner of my Catholic religion, and I also can see much fault, as I think I explained. Have you got a copy of the book there? Let me just...
I'll wave it in front of you.
In there are chapters which are quite critical of dimensions of the Roman Catholic Church under previous popes, praiseworthy as well. And I predicted Pope Benedict would resign in that book, and in fact he's now resigned, replaced by Pope Francis, and it has helped renew my faith. But over the years, it's been up and down. What anchored it, I guess, was a mixed marriage with my parents, a father who was Anglican, a mother who was Dutch Catholic, and away we went with the good Sunday lunch family debates on everything, including religion. But it was always there. It was encouraged by a Jesuit education, and it just sits there, but I rarely discuss it in any fora. It has helped me through some very difficult times in my life, in the army, in Parliament, and even in Rome.
What about when the values that you have in your Catholic life are clearly out of step with what would be expected with the secular public mainstream view of Australia today? And the one that I got from your book was your discussion about women in the Catholic Church. And you make some very important points about that the Catholic Church must do much, much more to get women into positions of hierarchy, but you stop at believing that women should be bishops, which I actually found quite humorous, given that Tony Abbott says you have to be a bishop and you're going to be a woman if you're going to be on the front bench. Now I think that I feel confident to say that certainly most secular Australians would find that
a contradiction. I equally argue that priests in the Catholic Church should be able to resume the 1100-year-old rule of being able to marry. From 0 to 1100 AD, Catholic Church priests were allowed to marry. It's not doctrinal. There is absolutely no reason why Pope Francis next week could not alter that particular rule. The matter is an onward debate as to whether it's technically doctrinal. I won't bore the audience with it, that you cannot have Roman Catholic female bishops. Let me say I'm of that view. I explained it in the book, but I think there's another dimension to this. Take the issue of pornography. I was around in State Parliament when Eric Willis banned, on its second day of showing, the comedy, the live show, whatever, Hair. What would you call it? A play, a musical? The musical, Hair. Okay, because there were naked people dancing on the stage. I thought it was a buzz of a show, and I was totally furious with Eric Willis, who was, in another era, in my view, and a short-lived Premier of New South Wales, for daring to ban a bit of life and spice. And God, it was on in the middle of the King's Cross. Where else would you put Hair on at that particular time?
Spring Street, I think.
But how things have changed. And yet there is a very difficult issue of freedom for adults to watch whatever they might want vis-a-vis a set of values. Where do you draw the line? I think Google has just reinstated, or YouTube's just reinstated, decapitation as being permissible. Well, this is an onward debate. I will always be guided by my faith, but you don't necessarily have easy answers to these very complex issues, most notably pornography, which should be an absolute no-no below for children.
See, I really deeply want to believe that my Prime Minister of the day, whoever he or she might be, would believe that I or any woman could do anything that they were physically and intellectually capable of doing, that is just simply the world we live in right now.
You've come a long way.
Oh, Tim.
Premier? Victoria? Twice? Female? Prime Minister? Female?
Yeah. And we have one woman in our cabinet right now.
On the board of BHP?
We have...
Not enough. Enough in both cases.
Well, I don't think we've come anywhere near as far as I'd thought, actually. And I don't want to believe that Tony Abbott doesn't think that women can do anything. And this is where the private, while also really respecting his faith, I want my Prime Minister to believe in something. And there's this lovely little book that I've read that Roy Williams, he may even be here, In God They Trust. It's a history of the faith of all of the Australian Prime Ministers. And it turns out most Australians like them to believe in something as well. But it's more important to me that my Prime Minister believes that if I want to grow up, or some daughter of mine wanted to grow up and be a bishop, they could.
The wonderful quote of Martin Luther King, that the arc of history moves slowly, but it moves toward justice. Well, it's pretty slow right at the moment. It looks a little stalled, but in my church, the first woman was ordained a minister back in 1977. They can be leaders. I remember as a child watching my mother say to my father, because only men could be leaders in the church, they were called deacons in the Baptist system. Now, you've got to know that this person's sick. You've got to know that we need to raise some money for this. You've got to look after the youth minister because he's having struggles. And my dad would take notes and go off to be the leader at the church. I realised very early on it was women running the church. All that we were doing was making them have to be manipulative so the men could pretend to be in charge and running the church. And I'm very glad that, at least in our tradition, and I totally agree with Tim that I think it might take 100 years, but women will get there. On Roy Williams' book, by the way, it's fantastic insights, and reading about Gough Whitlam's parents who met at Murrumbina Baptist down the road here. I remember my first letter from Gough. My dear minister, I much prefer to address you that way than your brother, but I do not write to make that point. Your article in the Sydney Morning Herald this week was worthy of St Paul, but neither do I write to make that point. And he wanted to talk about faith, and we got together, we had a chat, and he said, I believe Jesus died, of course. I believe he rose from the dead. All the evidence points to that. But I can't believe that he's coming back again. So I can't call myself a Christian, can I? And I said, well, Gough, I reckon 2 out of 3 is pretty good.
I mean, I've just brought up some of the sort of anxiety, I suppose, that some people, not everybody has, about not just Tony Abbott, of course, but he's the guy in the chair at the moment. There's a potential upside, I think. I mean, Tony Abbott has said that he has never made a political decision based on his Catholicism. I simply don't believe him, but that doesn't bother me either. That I don't see why he would argue about that. But what might he bring to this through a sense of the sacred that perhaps somebody of more secular views couldn't? And I mean, I think of something like Indigenous affairs, or just having a sense of the sacred.
I think he will drive a practical priority and agenda with regard to Indigenous affairs a very long way. He's got belly commitment. Out of his very central core beliefs is a sense of the injustices that have gone on, the failed policies that have gone on, and the like with regard to Indigenous affairs right across Australia, the failures in education and health, and the need to make them fiercely independent and successful in our society. And I think you're going to see a lot more of Tony Abbott. I think you, Sally, have done well to finger that one. But to think that he will then apply some sort of absolute prism of a Judeo-Christian ethic to every single decision in a rigid way, I don't think so. I think it'll just sit there. Yes, the Cabinet will pause. I think the other area which watch closely will be education and the government school system and the non-government school system and weightings and fundings and aspects of that debate, most notably at primary and secondary level. And that's a very, very important area of deliberation for any government in the 21st century, and it goes to the very future of the fabric of this nation. I think, yes, he will be again guided by a Judeo-Christian prism, but not to the point where it will be leading him other than to make what's the best decision for, in his view, the people of Australia.
I remember Burnham. He's the man in 1988 planted an Aboriginal flag in England and claimed it in the name of Indigenous tribes. Burnham made the point that Jerry Hander, I think was the Indigenous minister at that stage, atheist, secularist, couldn't understand Indigenous people if he didn't understand faith and spirituality. And I thought that was actually an interesting point. Like you, Sally, if I pick up the implication in your question, I would actually personally be comfortable if Tony and politicians who have faith on either side were actually upfront about how faith does influence their decisions. I think the foolish discussion that we get into which is a misunderstanding of the Constitution, that religion and politics have to be separated, that's just a provision to say there shouldn't be an established church, there shouldn't be a public test of religion for office. I actually think, of course, faith needs to be debated in the public square, openly, transparently about how it shapes policies. We're all driven by motivations. And to actually say this has got nothing to do with faith, I think is a bit of a nonsense. I don't know if we're mature enough to allow that, but I would actually welcome that. And I can't see, for that matter, on conscience votes, why it's just euthanasia. I don't see why asylum seekers shouldn't be a conscience vote. I don't see why faith that is strongly in politics isn't talked about on a whole range of issues. People don't have to agree, but to put it out there, I think, would be a lot more mature and healthy.
Well, and people of faith are not the only people that have inner conflicts in their political life. You just look where Malcolm Turnbull is with his party on something like climate change. But they're the only ones that have a contract with God, which is different.
Sorry, Tim.
Go on.
If by that you mean the sort of faith that is the faith rather than I believe. So there's a whole lot of I often say, let the best of faith try and defeat the worst of religion. The faith, which is a religious prescription, and Tim as a Catholic has talked openly about where he challenges his church, comes out of his belief, even though the faith might be quite prescriptive. I think if you're suggesting a contract with God is I speak with ex cathedra authority, yes, that's very worrying. However, I believe, and this is because as I struggle with my conscience in prayer, understanding what I believe, I think that should be out there.
The public square is a challenging place at the best of times. Here's two examples. Burnham's was Harry Penrith, in fact, and he was a friend of my brother's, and we went to a football match at Narrandera many years ago, the three of us. And for the first time in my life, I sensed overt racism being directed that we were standing with a full-blooded Aboriginal of great intellect and great purpose in Harry, late Harry Penrith, and that was a real wake-up call for me. Switch forward, walking through Tullamarine Airport with a certain Archbishop in his full regalia about a year ago, and the tension of negativity was palpable. And I thought, gosh, I must be back in federal politics again. Is it me? And then I decided to drop back about 4 paces and calibrate. It was him. It was the Archbishop that was copping the lot, and rightly so. Wrongly so in respect of him, but rightly so that churches are under attack in respect of too slow, unforgivable dealing with child sex abuse. And the business of shuffling priests out to Mildura from Ballarat, Monsignor in one particular case, totally unacceptable. And I hope, and I see signs that Rome is moving very firmly with regard to this. Both Benedict and Francis have said it's just not on, but then they've got to drive their Praetorian Guard to make sure it's not on. But the reason I mention that is because in the public square, we are done over. Those of you who are of the Judeo-Christian faith, you don't get much airing of it in a way which is purposeful and positive. Tim gets a good deal of good media coverage, more related to his causes and his faith, but you've got to battle away for that. Whenever a person of a cloth, if I can use that old phrase, trips up on something, they get absolutely pummeled in a way where an atheist or an agnostic trips up on something, their particular belief of atheism is never challenged. It's a brutal public square. I think we've got to step up and find smarter ways to step up. And a good starting point will be to ensure that every member of the clergy and every parish priest gets some basic media training so that when they eventually get a microphone in front of them, they don't stumble around and they can actually communicate.
Tim Fischer, you acknowledge in the book that the Holy See is not just the governing body of the church but a political entity as well, and that the church has been involved in politics for a very long time. We've been talking so far more about how the individual beliefs of leaders and politicians may influence what they do, how they do it. But what's the influence of the Christian church in Australia? What do we need to know about...
Well, the big one, historically, I think, has got to be... Well, let's nominate two. The defeat of the conscription referendums in World War I was thanks to Raheen. Archbishop Mannix, Bishop Mannix, then Archbishop Mannix, absolutely had an Irish hatred of everything. It's not what you think it is.
What about today, though? I'm talking about today rather than historically.
Well, the school, state aid, 1960s, to creep forward at least 50 years, was, I think, that battle was won for what is correct and best for this nation, and it was won because of the Christian churches stepping up in a very purposeful way in the 1960s.
I was going to come to this, but I'll ask you, because you mentioned it before too about schools, watch education with the new government, and you've just mentioned that school funding and instruction. I mean, this is another debate where from time to time, you need to have a conversation about what is an appropriate level of or type of religious instruction for Australian kids in state schools. And a lot of people, I think, and I would be one of them, would question the emphasis. I happen to be Jewish. I'm not saying that we need to have access to every kind of religious denomination, but that religious education should be taught by scholars of theology, not from people from a particular religion, particularly evangelising groups that are coming into state schools, often without their kids' parents really actually knowing. Is it time for a conversation like that again?
I think my colleague Tim would be better placed to respond in detail. Can I just give a broad brush response? John Monash was our greatest general, bar none. He fell out with Billy Hughes through no fault of his, who's kept one step in rank down. I will argue that he should be made Field Marshal posthumously in the centenary year of Gallipoli. He was a great Jewish leader, as well as everything else, and he persuaded Victorian State Parliament not to go ahead with a cenotaph blocking Burke Street, but in fact to go ahead with the shrine referred to earlier by Tim. His best quote, the quote that kept me going on the darkest days in the Hanson era and other eras of federal parliament, is a very simple one. It was a letter to the Grimwade family declining to lead a coup d'etat in the Great Depression. And he said, the best hope for Australia is the ballot box and good education. I'll just repeat that quote. The best hope for Australia is the ballot box and good education. And I declined to lead a coup d'etat, and he allowed the parliamentary system to play out the Great Depression, and things changed. So at one level, the emphasis on education is very important for the future of this nation, and yes, It does involve complexities with regard to religion and faith. With regard to the state school systems, surely it should not be in there fighting for conversions, but it should be there to provide a knowledge and a basis. But let me yield to Tim on that.
Yeah, so there's two separate issues here. One is the religious schools, and secondly, in secular schools, religious teaching. And I think the history of Australia, and Tim's been talking about this, is quite interesting insofar as of the 25 biggest charities in Australia, 23 are Christian faith-based. In America, very religious America, of the 25 biggest charities, only 10 are Christian faith-based. In the UK, only 3 out of 25 are. And when you actually go back, and this is going somewhere, and look at before, certainly the Second World War and certainly the Education Acts, universal education and secular, European nations and others turn to the state to say, we'll deliver services, we'll deliver education. In Australia, maybe because of the strength of churches and church schools, they said, actually, a whole lot of education and social services, we'll still look to the churches to do them. They are a vehicle that's relatively cheap. By the way, government still does this today with churches, where even though attendance might be dropping, in terms of their service delivery, they're large. So quite a different response to Europe, which actually looked at much clearer state vehicles than churches to deliver a whole range of services, including education. With the trade-off on universal education that is secular, by secular, they meant non-sectarian. They didn't actually mean not having any religious input. There was still a very religious society when these Education Acts went through. And that tradition has continued to say, actually, even in state schools, if they don't know the story of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, how will they read Milton or Shakespeare or even Manning Clark's History of Australia? All these metaphors are religious. However, the question that you raise around proselytising, going in to say we are actually here to get people converted, I think is really a worry in a state school. I think the implication that this isn't about religious education and telling you that here are rich stories that have shaped this culture, and to take a stand in terms of understanding this culture, you need to indwell some of these stories and understand them, but is actually just about conversion, I think is a matter for proper concern.
Can it be properly governed when it's volunteer-based?
Well, I think the school principals, if they're doing their job, will blow the whistle pretty quickly if it's beyond the proper remit for that chaplain in that Box Hill Public School, Box Hill High School, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, look, I think the regulation of it, so much isn't run by the state now today, that regulation in a whole range of service deliveries has to be appropriate and light touch. I think it can be done.
Tim, I didn't get your response on the institutional power of the church today, because we tracked down the education path. So what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you've triggered a whole lot of Baptist in me. And essentially Baptist John Bunyan, writing Pilgrim's Progress in Bedford Prison, is saying whenever church as institution does a deal with state power, becomes the chaplain to power, which is what a state church often is, whenever it's an institution, it loses true belief and movement stuff. So it was Baptists in Rhode Island, Roger Williams, who had the first constitution to separate church and state. It was the Virginian Baptists who came to Jefferson and said, when he was going to set up an Episcopalian, name for Anglicans in America, state church in the Constitution, this is wrong. America should separate church and state. Now, this is a very Baptist statement, one that I take very seriously. So whenever the institution actually is looking for privileges from the state and repays those privileges with favours to the state, I think you've debased faith. We can go right back to Constantine declaring that essentially Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. So up to then, Christians whose extraordinary ability to see people come to faith isn't because they've got great preaching and great theology, but because Greco-Roman world only had schools for the rich, only had hospitals and health for the rich. Christians ran them for anyone, saying God loves everyone. Not just Christians, they ran schools, they ran hospitals, they cared. So they go from being regarded as strange and odd that they do this, but still often getting persecuted if they didn't sign up to Rome's power, to actually becoming the institutional religion. And in that Constantinian compromise, I think you have still the great shadow and danger for the church when it does deals with the state.
And 3 quick examples. It was Holy See that effectively signed off on the creation of Portugal as a subset of Spain 1,000 years ago. It's the Holy See that Hillary Clinton said played a very powerful role, Pope John Paul II, in helping to bring the Berlin Wall down through bringing democracy to Poland. And it was the Holy See that initiated a treaty involving cartologists that went right down the Andes and separated out 900 different border disputes and established a border treaty once and for all between Argentina and Chile. And that process commenced within 24 hours, just ahead of a major bombing raid Argentina was going to hit up on Chile, and that was only 26 years ago. So there are times when, at the international level, the holy/unholy See, some would say, has stepped up as the nation, city, state that it is. You're probably going to see less of that now. I think you're going to see a more pastoral-orientated Holy See focused on getting the church right, as in the Roman Catholic Church. But over the years, at that level, there has been quite substantial intervention in world affairs.
If you have a question, please put your hand up, and if somebody puts a microphone in it, you can talk.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the 2 Tims what relevance liberation theology has for some Australians. I'm thinking particularly of Indigenous Australians. But I'm also thinking of the increasing number of Australians who are falling between the cracks in an age of neoliberalism.
So on liberation theology, I think it was a response to the cry of the poor in the favelas and the base communities movement, and particularly exhibited in Oscar Ramiro's assassination at the altar, when he was a very doctrinaire and conservative archbishop who then was exposed to the poor and said, whose side the church on of the junta or on the side of the people? And liberation theology, I think, was a really contextual, powerful response. But it made a big mistake. I think liberation theology's economics were very suspect. Its economic dependency theory was the poor are only poor because the rich are rich. So it bought into a Marxist ideology, and I don't have time to go into why I don't think that actually is right, but I think it was a wrong theory of economics that undergirded the right cry of hearing what the poor were suffering. Neoliberal, that's really a statement that almost has too much faith in the market. The market has no morals, the market does fail, the market still is the best allocator of preferences and resources that we've got, but subject to that, neoliberalism's faith in that market sometimes takes on almost a religious adherence, and that's when it worries me.
And the regulators, be they Christian or otherwise, have got to do a much better job at pinging those who break the rules with regard to the operations of the market broadly stated, whether it's the LIBOR scandal, banks, London, or whatever, the global financial crisis, Lehman Brothers and the like.
Hi, I'm quite interested in your comment around religion being persecuted in the public square. I thought it was quite an interesting analogy that you drew between racism and, I guess, the current persecution that you see religious figures receiving. And I wonder if this is possibly something to do with the relevance that religion kind of plays in current society, and particularly considering the position that the church has taken on gay marriage. And
very briefly, I do think religion's brought itself into this troubled arena and underplayed its hand, and badly played its hand, with regard to modern communications, with regard to handling mass media. And perhaps we're seeing some change in that. I think Tim has always done it very well, has jumped out across the ABC airwaves and beyond. I think there have been other people, you won't always agree or disagree with them, who are terrific. We just need more of them, and we need more younger ones articulating, if we're to even up the public square, which, it's my view, remains heavily slanted against, the stepping off point is always against criticising and almost snide referencing of anyone who is a member of a clergy, let alone anyone who publicly professes their faith.
I would add, I think there is a sensitivity to minority faiths and to their belief systems that isn't paid to Christianity. And that's props because of the dominant position Christianity's had and the mistakes that Tim's referred to. But I certainly see that. But I do think you can't just say this is a hostile secularism that just wants to jump whenever Christians trip up. I think there are secular fundamentalists who are very, very hostile. I put the Dawkins and the Hitchens in that category. But I think their question is religion true? No, it's not. Let's go after them. Then there's a whole second group of secularists, Alain de Botton and others, who say, what's the meaning of religion? And that's why Alain de Botton can write a magnificent book called Religion for Atheists, which is one of the best books on religion I've ever read. Quite extraordinarily sensitive and appreciative of what faith does, of how it can actually heal and create community and bind up. And so I don't think it's just every secularist is anti-religion, but I do think it's true that if you're the dominant Christian faith, as we are in this country, you do sense that there is a hostility that other faiths would never, ever be on the receiving end from.
Thank you very much for this evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm a non-Catholic working in a large Catholic health system in Melbourne, and Brand Catholic has its own interesting dimension at the moment. And back in the public square, Tim, I'm thinking about you walking through the airport and looking uncomfortable with your accomplice. One of the things that I struggle with is, with Tony Abbott in particular, is his relationship with George Pell. And I'm just wondering, I'm scared of that.
Why exactly?
Because I think that the more I've got to know about the Cardinal, the more I'm so concerned about his actions around the child sexual abuse, his conservatism. And I'm just wondering, and I guess, yes, I've just read David Marr's quarterly essay. I'm nervous about that part of the Catholic Church, or that representation of the Catholic Church, which isn't the one that I know and work in and see doing really good work and creating faith communities separately. It's quite separate to that. I'm scared of that ritual, I'm scared of that conservatism, I'm scared of that pomp and circumstance that doesn't fit where I want our country to be.
Well, there's high churches, there's low churches, there's within the Anglican Church and Anglican Communion, within the Catholic, there's a whole lot of variations, and where your and my centre line might be surprisingly close together, because it is. I came back through Africa, and there's a lot of good work going on there. 1,000,000 miles from Rome, and whatever Rome is, or for that matter, from the Lambeth Palace and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Really good work by very brave people with minimum resources, such as solidarity with South Sudan, men and women of the cloth working together, teaching them how to farm, sustainable farming, giving education in the world's newest nation, South Sudan. It's just glorious stuff, 1,000,000 light years from incense, bells and smells. But, everyone will find their centre line. With regard to the specific question you ask, I trust whoever the Prime Minister is of the day, having gone through the machinations of being elected leader of his party or leader of her party, and then become Prime Minister by winning an election or whatever, to have the common sense and the common decency and courtesy to the people who have elected him to take advice from a wide cross-section, including senior elders of various religions, including His Eminence Cardinal George Pell, and filter that through the prism of what's right for the nation. And I think, yes, he may sup with George Pell. Yes, he may sup with Archbishop Welby, the new and refreshing Archbishop of Canterbury, due to visit Australia, and others, and with Tim Costello. But at the end of the day, a Prime Minister then has to weigh all the options and the priorities and the policies and the budgets and reach a conclusion. I am not worried that he will wine and dine and have meetings with a cardinal, an archbishop, a bishop, or better still, some of the younger brigade coming through in all the Judeo-Christian religions, some really exciting people that I want to see step up, and the sooner the better.
Let me just say, I think, apropos my earlier comments about politicians and pragmatism, that Tony Abbott at the end of the day will be very pragmatic. I don't think you have a lot to fear that somehow Cardinal Pell will be setting his agenda. I think that's not a realistic fear. Look, on the abuse in the church, and we've obviously heard that there's allegedly 6 times more in the Catholic Church, or as much as all the other Christian churches put together. Whether true or not, I think the church, and perhaps the Catholic Church particularly, really have to come to grips with clericalism. And why I say that is that the people who were abused and their families were just as much members of the church, part of the flock, as the priests. And I think clericalism somehow seemed to protect those who were ordained and representing Christ on earth than people who were just as much, and there were victims, part of the flock. I think for all churches, that's one of the real standouts of what we're seeing with the Royal Commission. And I might add that Abbott, just to reassure you, when Julia Gillard said we're going to have a Royal Commission, Abbott absolutely agreed. He didn't resist that.
Interesting that we've finished tonight with the sort of anxiety that opened the conversation, though there's a lot more talking to be done. But gentlemen, I appreciate very, very much you both coming this evening, being so open. Tim Fischer, you said it's something that you don't usually talk about, and Tim Costello is eloquent as always, and thank you very, very much, both of you.